This morning's scripture reading can be found in Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. You are able to drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with." They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." The word of the Lord. Praise God.
The other night, John Paul and I watched the movie Kicking and Screaming. Does anyone know that movie? Good, okay. It's the title of a 2005 Will Ferrell and Robert Duvall comedy about a father-son rivalry and children's soccer. Actor Robert Duvall is the hyper-competitive, sports-obsessed, athletically gifted father of the adult Will Ferrell, who is supremely uncoordinated and never has had any athletic ability, not as a child nor as an adult. So Duvall coaches his 9-year-old grandson's soccer team. So he's his grandson's coach for a time. However, Duvall ends up cutting his grandson from the team, Will Ferrell's son. The boy gets cut because Duvall feels his grandson isn't a good enough player to play soccer for his team. Ferrell is incensed that his son got cut from his father's team, so Ferrell, who has no coaching experience or athletic ability, becomes coach of a rival team so that his son can play soccer and so that Ferrell can get back at his father, at Duvall. So Ferrell's motivation in becoming a coach is to beat his father's soccer team at all costs. So he brings on a ringer assistant coach who happens to be Mike Ditka of the Chicago Bears football team's Super Bowl winning coach, and who also happens to be the next door neighbor and mortal enemy of Duvall, Ferrell's father. So the two coaches of the 9-year-old soccer teams, the father Duvall versus the son with the famous assistant coach Ferrell, they have an all-out rivalry. They hold nothing back in order for their teams to compete for the championship title. Both want to win at all costs. It's a funny movie, and perhaps you can tell from this brief summary, it portrays and pokes fun of over-the-top soccer, sports, moms and dads and coaches and family rivalries and father-son competition and winning at all costs. And then in the end, the characters find perspective and realize that being first and winning at all costs is not what's ultimately important. It seems to me that this movie, Kicking and Screaming, ties in with our gospel passage for today because of the question James and John ask of Jesus. They ask Jesus if he will grant them to sit, one at his right hand and one at his left, in his glory. They want to be seen with Jesus as champions on top, as the winners. The three lead disciples, if such a designation exists, Peter, James, and John, experienced the transfiguration with Jesus dazzlingly up on the mountain just previously in Mark 9. These disciples were chosen by Jesus to experience that awesome event. So perhaps from that previous transfiguration experience, James and John got a taste of glory and a sense of what glory might look like when they make this bold request of Jesus. James and John are brothers. They're the sons of Zebedee, also referred to in Mark 3 by Jesus as the sons of thunder. Perhaps he calls them this because he knows they're fiery and competitive and fierce. Maybe he calls them this because they like to make a racket. In this passage, we learn that James and John want to be near as possible to Jesus when he's in his glory. How did that request strike you when you heard it? When Marianne read it to us in Scripture? In the Bible study class this past week, as we were reading this passage together, many of us heard this request as bold, brazen, power-grabbing, arrogant, self-serving. It seemed to us that James and John wanted to be known as the important ones, as the right and left-hand men of the king. They wanted to be on the winning team. They wanted to be known as those who were on top. The other disciples hear James and John's request similarly, it seems. That is, in a similar way that we hear this passage. The passage says, when the 10 heard this request, they began to be angry with James and John. They get irritated that these two disciples are seeking to be elevated and wanting to be seen as important and above the others. It seems they feel that James and John aren't playing by the rules. So we get a glimpse of what we might call today healthy rivalries. Other team members, so to speak, wondering why their teammates are jostling for better positions and then getting outwardly angry about it. So we get a glimpse in this passage of disciples seeking their advantage, finding the opening to move into a spot of prominence. We could call this behavior perhaps being at the right place at the right time. And we could perhaps see James and John's request as seizing the opportunity when it's presented. Jesus hears their request and hears the irritation of the other 10, and Jesus, in characteristic fashion, answers a question with a question. First, he asks James and John, "Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with?" We have a reference here, as you may have heard it, to the sacraments of the church. This is how we hear cup and baptism. Hebrew listeners would have understood cup and baptism as two metaphors referring to punishment and suffering. In the Old Testament, the word for cup is used metaphorically to refer to divine wrath or punishment in Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Recall Jesus' prayer in the garden to be spared the cup if it's God's will. Let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but thine. Jesus is asking James and John if they can accept that same kind of suffering that Jesus now faces. The use of baptism is also a metaphor for suffering. Old Testament references to waters overwhelming the sufferer in lament psalms may have provided the origin for this metaphor. And recall the Red Sea when the chariots and the Egyptian pursuers were overwhelmed by the waters. Jesus, after posing his question, then knowingly responds to James and John that indeed the cup he drinks, they will drink. And the baptism with which he's baptized, they will be baptized. He seems to know that they will undergo great suffering and trial. They will endure and persevere. And he then invokes his Father by telling them it's not his to grant who's going to be at his left and right. Only God knows these things. It's interesting to note, however, here, that when Jesus is elevated on the cross, the ones who do end up on his left and on his right are a thief and a criminal, not necessarily what James and John had in mind when they were making that request. So then Jesus turns his attention to the 10 who are jealous and irritated at James and John for even asking such a question. Jesus calls them all together and he says, "Everything is different with me. You know how the Roman Empire does things. Think of those who are regarded as rulers in our world. They wield their authority over their subjects, lording it over them. They exercise authority as tyrants. This is not how I exercise my authority. And this isn't how anyone associated with me will exercise his or her authority." And he continues, "To be great in my realm is to be a servant. To be first in my kingdom is to be a slave." He'd already told them previously that to be first required them to be last. He'd already demonstrated this when he called the little ones to him, the children, those who were least in that realm. And so Jesus repeats himself here, and then he takes lordship to the extreme. Greatness among Jesus' followers is measured by their ability to live as servants and slaves, even if that life means suffering oppression at the hands of those who would wield power. I think this is one of the hardest passages in the Bible for us to hear and to understand. We have to be careful not to judge the disciples too harshly for their failure to understand. Personal ambition did not start with James and John, and nor did it end with them. Think of how it is today. Today, many of us are enamored with and in awe of Hollywood stars. We love and elevate famous athletes, even though many of them use their considerable influence and wealth to promote violence, illicit sex, drugs, and vulgarity. We envy super wealthy CEOs and CFOs who get rich by increasing sometimes short-term profits, often at the expense of laid-off employees, and who, when their actions produce long-term ruin, bail out, protected by golden parachutes. We spend so much time talking about politicians and then electing politicians who sell their souls to special interests and who spend their lives shading the truth to serve their personal interests. James and John are not unique when it comes to looking out for number one and for being tempted by titles, placement at the table, rivalries, wanting to be seen as important, and winning at all costs. the one you and I worship and serve, calls his followers to a radically different way. No one saw his kind of kingdom coming, and it took a long time to figure it out. As a matter of fact, we are still trying to figure out what Jesus means when he says, "Whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all." Some of us go into service to Christ kicking and screaming. I am encouraged by the fact that the failures of the disciples during Jesus' lifetime are not the final word about their faithfulness as followers. Although they may run away during the Passion, these same disciples will share in his suffering. Certainly, there are some people in our contemporary culture, in the times we live in today, who understand what it means not to be served, but to serve. As we were wrestling with this passage in the Bible study class this past Wednesday, I asked the group about the various mission and service programs of the church that have been meaningful to those who were there. I asked about times they could recall when people in this community of God's people were in service to others. And the conversation became animated and lively as the group was listing the many ways the saints and sinners at Potomac Presbyterian Church over the years have sought not to be served, but to serve. And from what they shared, many of you and many of our ancestors in the faith have been tireless deacons in service to Christ. And that is the Greek word that's used in this passage, diakonos, translated servant here. They talked about the servants from this congregation, such as Tom Haugen, who visits Poor Cristo every year with other medical doctors. We'll hear from Tom shortly about the work he was sent to do and from which he recently returned. They talked about Carolyn Stump, who had a personal connection with the Morgans, who are missionaries in Bangladesh, who this congregation supports through prayer and financial assistance. They talked about Mary Reichley, who started a local homeless shelter in this church before Interfaith Works was in the business. Potomac Presbyterian Church was turned into a homeless shelter for 1 week out of the year. And some of the folks in the Bible study recalled how Mary Reichley, with her self-deprecating sense of humor, called people into that ministry. Others recalled the work of Project Shine and the self-giving servant leadership of those who serve through the ministry of the Congregational Care Committee. Jesus does not require more than he is willing to give. He modeled service and sacrifice from cradle to grave. For Jesus, the cross is his throne. He reigns from the wood of a cross. And service, that is, not to be served, but to serve, service is the true form of authority for Jesus. When he's in service to others, that's when Jesus is on top. That's when he's number one. That's when he's winning at all costs. Along those lines, Anglican priest Ernest Southcott reminds us that the holiest moment of the church service is the moment when God's people, strengthened by preaching and sacrament, go out of the church door into the world to be the church. We don't go to church, we are the church. Let us live into this understanding of service and being the church as we turn now in our hymnals to hymn number 746. It's Tu Mamina, and we will stand and sing our way into service. May we not be ones who go kicking and screaming to service, but may we be those who are sent to be the church. You can stand. Saying, "To Mamina, send me."